Get out. You're trespassing on private property now. My sister didn't even wait for our father's grave to settle before she threw my suitcase into the mud and changed the biometric locks on the estate. I was the one who built Thorn Maritime into a $52 million empire while she was out burning through Dad's cash, but according to her, I was suddenly nothing. I spent that night in a rain-slicked motel room, clutching a folder of old shipping manifests, thinking I had lost everything. But the next morning, when I sat across from my father's shark of an attorney, he didn't offer condolences. He leaned back and laughed. "Callie," he whispered, sliding a thick legal packet across the desk, "your sister just made the most expensive mistake of her life. Did she actually think your father didn't know exactly who she was?" That's when I realized the inheritance wasn't a gift. It was a trap, and my sister had just walked right into the kill zone. The rain didn't just fall, it felt like a deliberate weight, a cold, heavy shroud wrapping around the coastal town of Blackwood Bay. I stood on the gravel driveway of the Thorn estate, the salt air stinging my eyes, holding the only things I had left, a single scuffed leather suitcase and the black wool coat I'd worn to watch my father, Silas Thorn, be lowered into the earth. The silence of the mansion behind me was more deafening than the storm. My older sister, Eleanor, stood in the grand archway of the front door, her silhouette framed by the warm, amber glow of the foyer, a warmth I was no longer allowed to feel. She didn't look like a woman who had just buried her only parent. She looked like a woman who had just won a war. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed my spare set of keys into the rising puddles at my feet. "This house, the firm, and every cent of the $52 million belongs to the primary heir, Callie," she sneered, her voice cutting through the wind like a serrated blade. "And since you've always been so independent, I'm sure you'll have no trouble finding a new place to sleep. Don't bother calling. The locks are already changed." The heavy oak door didn't just close. It boomed with a finality that shook the ground beneath my boots. I was Althea Callie Thorn, the woman who had spent the last decade in the engine rooms and boardrooms of Thorn Maritime, turning a struggling regional shipping line into a global powerhouse. I was the one who knew every captain, every port authority, and every line of code in our logistics software. Eleanor had spent that same decade in Paris and Milan, her only contribution to the family legacy being a string of maxed-out credit cards and tabloid scandals that Dad had paid millions to bury. Yet, here I was, standing in the mud while the parasite took the throne. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. There is a specific kind of cold that settles in your marrow when you realize your own blood would rather see you homeless than share a fortune they didn't earn. I dragged my suitcase down the long, winding drive, the iron gates clanging shut behind me with a metallic shriek that sounded like a funeral bell. I ended up at the Rusty Anchor, a derelict motel 3 miles down the coast where the neon sign hummed with a sick, flickering buzz. The room smelled of salt, damp carpet, and the stale cigarettes of 1,000 desperate souls. I sat on the edge of a bed that groaned under my weight, staring at the ceiling as the reality of my situation began to claw at my throat. I had nothing. My personal accounts had been linked to the family trust, which Eleanor had frozen the moment the heart monitor flatlined. My company car was gone. My home was gone. But as I reached into my coat pocket to find a hair tie, my fingers brushed against something stiff and cold, a manila folder I had snatched from Dad's private safe the night before he passed. At the time, I thought I was just protecting our latest shipping contracts from Eleanor's incompetence. I opened it now, the dim light of the motel room casting long, jagged shadows across the pages. Inside weren't just contracts. There were handwritten notes, maps of the Blackwood shipping lanes, and a single, heavy business card clipped to a document I hadn't seen before. The card belonged to Julian Vance, a man known in the legal world as the Great White because once he sank his teeth into a case, there was nothing left but bone. Dad had used Julian for the most sensitive, high-stakes acquisitions in Thorn Maritime history. Underneath the card, in Dad's unmistakable, sprawling script, were 6 words that made my blood turn to liquid nitrogen: "For when the wolves come home." I didn't sleep. I watched the sun crawl over the Atlantic horizon, a pale, weak light that offered no heat. By 8 a.m., I was standing in the lobby of Vance & Associates, my hair still damp from the rain, my eyes burning with a fire that hadn't been there the night before. Julian Vance didn't look like a lawyer. He looked like an undertaker. He was tall, dressed in a suit that cost more than a year of my salary, with eyes that seemed to see through skin and bone. When he saw me standing in his doorway, he didn't offer a handshake or a sorry for your loss. He checked his watch, leaned back in his leather chair, and let out a low, vibrating chuckle that sent shivers down my spine. 10 hours, he mused, his voice like grinding stones. I bet my lead partner you'd be here in 6. I suppose the rain slowed you down. I ignored the comment, dropping the folder onto his desk. Eleanor kicked me out. Julian. She claimed the entire $52 million estate as the sole primary heir. She's already liquidated the liquid assets and frozen my access to the maritime servers. I need to know if there's a loophole, or if my father really was that blind. Julian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into a humidor, clipped a cigar, and slid a heavy, wax-sealed envelope across the desk toward me. Your father wasn't blind, Callie. He was a predator. And he knew he raised one lion and one hyena. My heart hammered against my ribs as I broke the seal. The document inside was the true last will and testament of Silas Thorne. I skipped past the legal jargon, my eyes searching for the numbers, the names, the betrayal. I found it on page 4. Primary heir, Eleanor Thorne. I felt the air leave my lungs. My vision blurred. I had been right. He had left it all to her. I began to stand up, the room spinning, when Julian's voice cracked like a whip. Keep reading, girl. You were always too fast in the boardroom. Read the caretaker provision on page 9. I sat back down, my fingers trembling as I flipped the pages. There it was. A clause written in such specific, predatory detail that it could only have come from my father's mind. The inheritance of the primary heir is strictly contingent upon the moral fitness mandate. Should the primary heir fail to provide immediate, continuous, and dignified residence, support, and professional inclusion for the secondary heir, Callista Thorne, within the family estate, all rights to the Thorne Maritime Trust, the physical properties, and the liquid capital shall be deemed null and void. Violation of this clause constitutes a total forfeiture of the estate, effective immediately upon the documented act of exclusion. The room went silent. I looked up at Julian, who was now grinning, showing teeth that looked far too sharp for a human. She threw you out, didn't she? He asked, though he already knew the answer. In the rain. On camera. With witnesses from the security detail. I nodded, a slow, dark realization dawning on me. She didn't just kick me out, Julian. She changed the locks. She told me I was nothing while the gate cameras were rolling. Julian's laugh returned, louder this time, a jagged sound that filled the office. Eleanor just signed her own poverty warrant. She thought she was taking the crown, but she was really just stepping into the noose your father tied for her 10 years ago. He knew she'd do it. He banked on her greed being stronger than her brain. I felt a surge of adrenaline so potent it made my teeth ache. What's the move? I asked. Julian stood up, buttoning his coat. The move. We don't move. We execute. I've already flagged the trust accounts. The moment you provide the sworn affidavit and the footage from the gate, which I've already subpoenaed from the security firm, the Thorne fortune doesn't just freeze. It migrates. To you. Every cent. Every ship. Every brick of that house. He leaned over the desk, his eyes cold as the deep sea. And the best part. The clause includes an immediate vacancy order for the violating party. By noon, Eleanor won't just be broke. She'll be a squatter in a house that belongs to the sister she just tried to destroy. The drive back to Blackwood Bay felt like a victory lap. I sat in the back of Julian's black sedan, watching the coastline blur past. We weren't alone. Behind us was a second car carrying 2 private bailiffs and a locksmith. As we pulled up to the Thorne gates, the security guard, the same one who had watched me walk away in the rain the night before, looked like he wanted to crawl into a hole. He opened the gates without a word. We pulled up to the front circle, the tires crunching on the gravel. The house looked different now. It didn't look like a prison. It looked like a prize. We didn't knock. Julian walked up to the door and nodded to the locksmith, who made short work of the new biometric lock Eleanor had installed. The door swung open, and the sound of pop music and clinking glass drifted from the dining room. Eleanor was there, draped in our mother's vintage silk robe, a bottle of Dad's most expensive vintage open on the table. She was laughing into her phone, probably telling one of her socialite friends how she had finally handled the family problem. When she saw me walk in, followed by a team of men in suits, her face didn't just fall, it turned a sickly, translucent shade of grey. "What is this?" she shrieked, slamming the glass down. "Callie, I told you to stay away. I'll have you arrested for trespassing." Julian Vance stepped forward, pulling a gold-rimmed pair of glasses from his pocket. "Actually, Eleanor, the only trespasser here is you." He opened the leather folio and began reading the caretaker provision in a voice that sounded like a death sentence. As the words hit her, forfeiture, null and void, immediate vacancy, the bottle of wine slipped from her hand, shattering on the marble floor. The dark red liquid pooled around her feet, looking exactly like the blood she had tried to draw from me. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Dad wouldn't. He loved me. He wouldn't do this." "He loved the legacy more," I said, stepping toward her, my voice low and dangerous. "He knew you were a shark who didn't know how to swim. He gave you the keys to see if you'd use them to open the door for me, or lock me out. You chose the lock, Eleanor. And now, the lock is on you." The bailiffs moved in, handing her a pre-printed notice of immediate eviction. They didn't give her time to pack. They didn't give her time to call her friends. They escorted her to the door, her silk robe fluttering in the wind, her bare feet hitting the same cold gravel mine had the night before. She looked back at me, her eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic hunger. "Callie, please. We're sisters. You can't do this. Where am I supposed to go?" I stood in the doorway, the same doorway she had used to exile me, and felt a profound, chilling sense of peace. "The Rusty Anchor has a room open," I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings of my new home. "Room 214. It smells like bleach and failure. I think you'll fit right in." I didn't wait for her to answer. I closed the door. The click of the lock was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I walked into my father's study, sat in his chair, and opened the Thorn Maritime servers. The empire was back in the hands of the one who built it. The hyena was gone. The lion was home. For more powerful revenge stories, join the circle of justice below and never let the fire fade.